Walk with me through the halls of the Comic Kingdom. The Clock. The Clock is the first masked superhero in comic books, debuting in late 1936 from the Comics Magazine Company. He certainly doesn't get a lot of credit for it. The Clock started the ball rolling with costumed crime fighters in comic books. He was created by writer and artist George Brenner. The Clock wasn't the very first superhero. That distinction goes to Mandrake the Magician from the comic strip of the same name, debuting on June 11, 1934. The Clock was certainly influenced by Mandrake. Both were well-dressed, well-to-do heroes. However, there were some major differences. One of these was the fact that the Clock wore a mask. The Clock was a popular character for a while. Over time, the market became flooded with superheroes, and the Clock's novelty dwindled when incredibly wild characters like Superman, Batman, and Captain Marvel came out, to name only a few. By the time of the Clock's last comic in 1944, the character seemed pretty dull when you compared him to Aquaman or Green Lantern. Even the comic strip character of Dick Tracy, a plainclothes detective, was wilder than the Clock. The Clock was an inspiration for Will Eisner's later and much more famous superhero character of the Spirit. However, the Clock was a bit more grounded in reality, especially in the early days. Back then, Brenner's refusal to make the Clock incredibly strange might be what makes the character appealing to his fans today. Superheroes have become as weird as they can possibly get these days. It's about time for a more normal character that's just a little bit different. It does appear that George Brenner liked his character and did his level best on the art and writing. The Clock stories were interesting, easy to read comic adventures, and full of action. He was just an ordinary guy without superpowers, but he could do just about anything humanly possible. The Clock could fight like a monster and loved using gadgets and other scientific tricks. I like his cane with the spring-loaded head that he shoots at bad guys to knock them out. I also like the letters he wrote that would spontaneously burst into flames. He was also a master of hypnotism. These are just a few of his notable quirks. Who is the Clock? If you're expecting a guy in a clock costume, you're going to be sorely disappointed. He's just a guy in a three-piece suit who wears a black silk cloth over his face. He wasn't superpowered. Don't get bummed by this description. The Clock is anything but boring. For the longest time, the reader didn't know anything about the Clock. We didn't know his real name or see his real face. He was a master of disguise. What was his reason for fighting crime? We didn't know. We do know that he hated gangsters. He used science and gadgetry. The Clock would use guns if he had to, but he wasn't a killer. Still, criminals often died when he pursued them, often by their own recklessness. We didn't even know that the city the Clock operated in was New York until later on. The Clock was much more mysterious in his early adventures. As time went on, Brenner felt the need to give him things like a civilian identity, a supporting cast, and a backstory. The first recurring character in the Clock stories was Police Captain Kane. In the early stories, Captain Kane was extremely adversarial to the Clock, treating him worse than a criminal. Eventually, this idea was abandoned, and Captain Kane became Clock's buddy, much like the relationship between Batman and Commissioner Gordon. But why did he call himself the Clock? Our hero would leave behind business cards with a clock insignia and a message on them, with some variation of the catchphrase, "The clock strikes." Hey, the Lone Ranger had silver bullets, Spider-Man left notes, and the Clock left behind business cards. All the coolest heroes leave something behind. What do we know about the Clock? Most comic book writers in the Golden Age created characters you had to take at face value. Sometimes you didn't know everything about your hero, and there wasn't always an origin story. This practice wasn't necessarily out of laziness. Comic stories were shorter back then, and it was more important to have action, neat visuals, and some interesting dialogue. Characters would be fleshed out over time. Information about the clock himself came in bits and pieces throughout his 8-year career in comics. His real name was Brian O'Brien. He was born into riches and was considered a society dude. Still, he had a desire to help the less fortunate. In his earlier adventures, he was always giving money to poor children. As the series evolved, his goodwill extended to anyone who had fallen on hard times. O'Brien had graduated from college and was a boxing champion. On top of being a society playboy, he was also a wealthy young sportsman. Brian was close friends with Captain Kane of the police department, but Kane had no idea Brian was the clock. Brenner didn't like to specify the city, but it was always expected to be New York. It took a long time, but Brenner let this leak out when he mentioned O'Brien living on Park Avenue. The clock had a father who knew his secret. He appeared in only one story and was briefly mentioned in another before being dropped altogether, like he never existed. It would be later stated that only his first sidekick, Pug, knew the clock's identity. Then it was his second sidekick, Butch, who was the lone holder of Clock's secret. Brenner himself always forgot to include the Orchid in these statements. This strange lady also knew his secret and had known it since early in the character's existence. The Orchid. Ooh, she's so sexy. Besides Captain Kane and the Clock's later sidekicks, the only other significant character in his cast was the Orchid. Who was the Orchid? She wasn't in his adventures all that often, but when she was, it was memorable. The Orchid was a beautiful woman who was every bit as mysterious as the Clock himself. She somehow knew his real identity, but worked on the side of good and directed the Clock to criminals who needed to go down. We don't know her name or her motivation for enlisting the Clock's help. What we do know is that the Clock was infatuated with her and promised to find out who she was. The Orchid made her first appearance in Detective Picture Stories number 2. She didn't make another appearance until Feature Funnies number 3. We don't see her again until Crack Comics number 2. In these first 3 appearances, we know what she looks like. After that, we didn't see the character again until Crack Comics number 27. Brenner decided to retool the concept. Now it was written that the Clock had never seen her before. He had only heard her voice and seen her in shadows. She appeared in the next issue as well for one last appearance. The Clock's first appearances. When did the Clock make his first appearance? This is a point of confusion for some people because he first appeared in 2 different comic books in the same month. It's generally accepted that the Clock's first appearance was in Funny Picture Stories number 1, cover dated November 1936. However, he also appeared in Funny Pages number 6 that same month. What was the difference? In Funny Picture Stories, his feature was called Alias the Clock, and they were full-length 7-page adventures. In Funny Pages, his feature was called The Clock Strikes, and it was only 2 pages long, hardly long enough to get into the story. He was only in the first 2 issues of Funny Picture Stories. His next full-length comics appeared in Detective Picture Stories number 2 and number 5, January and April of 1937, respectively. The Clock enjoyed a longer run in Funny Pages, appearing in issues number 6 through number 11, cover dated June 1937. In his last appearance of this title, the Clock was caught by Captain Kane in a cliffhanger ending that was never resolved. What happened? These comic book titles, at the time, were owned by the Comics Magazine Company. The publisher was sold to Ultim Publications. There are 2 schools of thought on what happened next. Some people believe that Ultim actually now owned the Clock and sold him, among other characters, to Quality Comics. However, some people believe that George Brenner himself actually owned the Clock character and decided to move over to the Quality Comics publisher. The latter would make sense, as Brenner remained the writer and artist. Either way, after the Clock's cliffhanger appearance in Funny Pages number 11, he moved over to Quality Comics. Ultim Publications didn't last very long. By 1938, the company was bought out and renamed to Centaur Publications. Even though new Clock stories were already being made at Quality, Centaur would publish reprints of the old Clock stories in their own titles. A lot of people still think the Clock came from Centaur, but in reality, the character was only ever made for two publishers, Comics Magazine Company and Quality Comics. Feature Funnies. The character's first appearance at Quality was in Feature Funnies number 3, cover dated December 1937. He remained with that series through number 20, after which it was renamed to Feature Comics, where he remained through number 31, April 1940. His feature was full length, but retitled to The Clock Strikes like the short stories had been. Brenner ignored the cliffhanger ending of Funny Pages number 11. Basically, nothing from the short comics had any effect on the character's continuity. Ultimately, the feature's title of The Clock Strikes would be shortened to just The Clock. Feature Funnies number 3 brought back the mysterious female character of the Orchid, who first appeared in Detective Picture Stories number 2. Besides Captain Kane, she was the only major recurring character during the Clock's early days. Orchid was a beautiful woman, but about as mysterious as the Clock himself. She helped Clock out on his cases, but her motivation wasn't always clear. She served as the potential love interest. In the Clock's early appearances at Quality, it appears as if Brenner was trying to reinvent his character. Maybe he wanted to ignore everything from his previous publisher altogether. In Feature Funnies number 7, the story was a reworking and, in some places, a direct copy of the story from Funny Picture Stories number 2. One sharp difference is that we now see Captain Kane acting favorably toward the Clock. Feature Funnies number 8 was a breakthrough for the character. Brenner had kept just about every facet of the Clock's private life a secret up until now. Then he gave us a whole bunch at once. It's the first time Park Avenue is mentioned, meaning that this has to be New York City. He had been dropping Fifth Avenue here and there as a clue, but Park Avenue really settled it. The Clock's real name is revealed to be Brian O'Brien, and he's obviously wealthy. Brian has a father who knows his secret. It's the first attempt on Brenner's part to give the Clock a companion. This is the only time we see Brian's father. We are also given a lame reason for Brian being the Clock. For excitement. No one would do what the Clock does just for kicks. Apparently, Brenner didn't like where this was going. We never see or hear about Brian's father after the small blurb about him in number 10. The Clock never mentions fighting crime just for fun ever again. He takes it a lot more serious than that. Much of the story in Feature Funnies number 9 was a reworking with recycled art from his very first appearance in Funny Picture Stories number 1. I think this was an attempt by Brenner to figure out what to do after his story in number 8. How he proceeded with the Clock from the next issue on is a strong indicator that he didn't like everything he had established, especially the father-son dynamic. Feature Funnies number 10 continues to elaborate on the Clock's backstory. The city is never specified as being New York, although we know it is. The Clock is said to have many hideouts throughout the city. And not that it's a major detail, but his mask is made out of black silk. It's also revealed that Brian has friends, and that he's a society dude. Feature Comics. Feature Comics number 21 was an interesting experiment. In the story, Brian O'Brien visits the 1939 World's Fair. He busts up a gang without ever wearing his mask. This is the first and only time that he ever did a story like this. Issue number 22, July 1939, also added something interesting. Captain Kane sees Brian O'Brien face to face at a policeman's ball. we find out that they know each other, but Kane has no idea O'Brien is the clock. The idea of these two seeing each other on a regular basis is used from here on. It raises an interesting question. The clock talks to Captain Kane on the phone all the time. Does Captain Kane just not recognize O'Brien's voice? Or does O'Brien disguise his voice when he's the clock? Brenner did a good job of expanding his character. In number 24, we discover that the clock's hat is made of rubber and designed to look like felt. It's to protect him from being knocked out by a blow on the back of the head. This is something that had happened in previous stories, so the rubber hat must have been a recent development. Sadly, he must have dropped his rubber hat, because the clock continued to get hit on the back of the head in future stories. Crack Comics, the Pug Brady era. The clock was moved to Crack Comics, beginning with its first issue, May 1940, to number 35, October 1944. After this, it was the end for the clock in the golden age of comics. Crack Comics number 1 did a few interesting things for the character. First of all, it established Brian O'Brien as a wealthy young sportsman. Before this, we just knew him as a society playboy who happened to be chummy with police Captain Kane. Before that, we just figured he was a rich guy. The other major thing this issue did was give the clock a sidekick. He never had one before. In this story, Brian O'Brien meets his uncanny look-alike, an ex-college athletic star and businessman named Pug Brady. Pug was the victim of serious foul play and down on his luck. Throughout the clock's entire saga, he was almost mental about keeping his identity a secret. For the first time ever, he entrusted his secret to someone. This was a big deal, and Pug Brady was a big part of the clock's comic adventures, at least for a while. In number 16, Pug was absent for the first time since his debut. No reason was given. We also find out a few more things about O'Brien in this issue. For sure, he was born to riches. He was also a boxing champion in college. Pug's last appearance was in Crack Comics number 17. He was mentioned, but not seen, in the splash panel of the next issue. No reason was ever given for his disappearance. What went wrong with the Pug character? It would be nearly impossible to find out for certain unless we were able to get a hold of George Brenner's personal notes, if he made any. We can only guess that he grew to dislike the character. At first, it may have seemed like a cool idea to give the clock a look-alike sidekick. As time went on, however, it appears as if it got harder and harder for Brenner to write for the character. Pug fought alongside the clock wearing a normal suit and a white handkerchief that covered his nose and mouth. This was even less interesting than Clock's outfit. Crack Comics, the Butch era. This era has all the action the clock ever had, but a lot more humor too. Beginning with number 21, February 1942, the clock was given a new sidekick with Butch, an orphan teenage tomboy who aspired to be a gangster's gun moll. In the golden age of comics, Butch never has a last name. When the clock is shot and nearly killed by a gangster, he is found by Butch and nursed back to health. He later saves Butch from getting killed by gangsters. After all this, she takes a romantic liking to the extremely reluctant clock and still thinks of herself as his gun moll, even though he fights gangsters. The clock promises to take legal steps to adopt her. Butch was a good character. George Brenner no doubt created her in response to Robin, Batman's very popular sidekick. This was an interesting spin on the kid's sidekick formula, as Butch was a girl and had romantic leanings toward her boss. She also dressed in very non-heroic Bonnie Parker attire. By the next issue, March 1942, the clock's look has changed. He went from the square-shaped mask that covered the whole face to a classic domino-style mask. There is no reason given for this. It's pretty much believed that Brenner did this to make his character look like the Spirit, a superhero character that became more popular than the clock. The Spirit debuted in the summer of 1940 and was said to have been influenced by the clock. In turn, Brenner borrowed from Eisner a bit. I think this domino mask was a better idea. What do you think? Brenner did a good job of developing the relationship between the clock and Butch. Initially, O'Brien did not want her to be a part of the action because her being known as Brian O'Brien's adopted daughter and fighting crime with the clock would give away a secret. He changed his mind, however, because he had to keep an eye on her. Brian made it very clear she would never get a gun, so she had to find other ways to fight bad guys. Butch could be very creative. Sometimes she would have caused less damage with a gun. When Butch was finally able to get a hold of a gun in number 23, she got so nervous she could barely hold it. Over time, she became less nervous of guns, and even held one. In number 25, there is a series of panels where Butch says she should have teamed up with the Spirit because he would appreciate her. The clock, apparently, does not think much of the Spirit and leaves in a huff. At this time, Brenner is certainly acknowledging the comparison between the clock and the Spirit. He was even trying to capture the same humorous tone of Spirit's comics. Issue number 27 brought back Clock's mysterious love interest of the Orchid, but Brenner completely broke continuity. In this adventure, Clock states that he has never seen her face and has only heard her voice. He only sees her in shadows. This is a direct contradiction to his first 3 encounters with the woman. Orchid appeared briefly in the next issue for one last time. These 2 appearances were cute for the fact that Butch was a little jealous of the Orchid. It was a one-sided rivalry, as Orchid barely knew she existed. After this, Clock's later appearances didn't always ring true. For instance, his stories in number 29, 33, and 35 were not signed by Brenner. This was unusual since Brenner liked to put his name on all his work. These were clearly done by someone else, as the art didn't even look the same. In number 32, Butch was not seen or mentioned. This was the only time she was absent from the clock's life since her debut. In number 33, one of the non-Brenner stories, the feature was called The Clock and Butch for the first and only time. Butch had become that important to the feature. Issue number 34 was weirdly done. The clock wears his mask for the entire story, even when he and Butch are in the privacy of their own home and answering the door for visitors. This went against everything the clock did in trying to protect his identity. Not only that, but the clock was getting more and more careless with having Butch being seen with him in public. She really should have had a costume. It's a shame the clock saga had to end in Crack Comics number 35, cover dated October 1944. He was given no send-off, he simply just stopped. Where did the clock go? Strictly nowhere. The clock just stopped making appearances. No one wanted to continue the character. After World War II, superhero comics took a big hit. Only a handful of the super popular superheroes like Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, among others, carried on unscathed. Some of the previous Golden Age characters that had been really popular at one time were retooled. Unfortunately, this didn't happen for the clock. Quality Comics ceased operations in 1956 and was acquired by DC Comics. For some reason or another, DC did not renew the copyrights on many of Quality's characters, including the clock. Therefore, these characters fell into the public domain. DC has rarely ever mentioned the clock's existence. Letting the clock become public domain was not a wise move on DC's part. How cool would it be to say that your company owns the very first superhero from comic books? Apparently, this did not mean much to DC Comics. The clock has been, for many, many years, an up-for-grabs character. Even at that, no one attempted to revive him until 1992. The Malibu Comics publisher brought him back in The Protectors number 1. Sort of. Brian O'Brien was now the president and retired from the superhero business. By issue number 20, May 1994, all the characters in this title were killed. Malibu was bought out by Marvel in 1994. In 2012, Marvel was bought out by Disney. Marvel never gave Malibu's properties any proper respect. It's unlikely Disney will do any better. Plus, why would they want to mess around with a public domain character they can't lock down in copyright? The Dynamite comics publisher released a more disgraceful version of the clock in 2013. This was in the series called Masks, beginning with issue number 3. Their version of the clock was a bad guy. Set in 1938, Brian O'Brien was a former district attorney who found the law too limiting and became the vigilante called the Clock. He became the leader of the fictitious Justice Party and took over New York State. O'Brien had aspirations of taking over the whole country. He had become an evil criminal mastermind and wore an all-white outfit, a la the Ku Klux Klan. He now called himself Master. He ended up getting killed by the Shadow in issue number 8. The entire handling of the clock by Dynamite Comics was very heartless. Where can the clock go from here? The possibilities are endless. The clock doesn't need to be retooled that much from the old days, although I do think new stories should be set in present day. I think there should be a little more clock symbolism so his character name makes more sense. Perhaps an insignia on his suit, or some clock-related gadgets. Butch needs to be with him, but she should be given a crime-fighting costume and a cool superhero name. If she was a bit older, like in her late teens or early 20s, she could go by the name Hourglass. These are just some of my ideas. What would you do with the characters? If any character from the world of comics has earned its due, it is certainly the Clock. He fully deserves his place in the Comic Kingdom.